Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for making AP Human Geography a part of your day. Today, we're going to be asking the question, why does population growth vary among regions? And to introduce that, we've got to talk about this thing called the demographic transition. We'll be describing the stages of the demographic transition today with the transfer goal of demonstrating open-mindedness and adaptability when dealing with multiple perspectives. Shall we go? I think we shall. Coming off the heels of Key Issue 2.2, like I'm looking at these guys and I'm looking at these guys and I'm thinking, I think I got a pretty good handle on MDCs and LDCs in terms of things like natural increase rates, crew birth rates, total fertility rates, infant mortality rates, right? Like more developed countries tend to have lower natural increase rates, lower CBRs, lower TFRs, lower IMRs. But actually, what's really crazy is the death rate doesn't follow the same pattern. As a matter of fact, when we're looking at the death rate, right? The crew death rate average, now again, this is just average and data is always changing, but for the most part, when we look at natural increase rates, developed countries are going to have low natural increase rate. Facts, right? Developed countries are going to have lower crew birth rate. Facts. These are just trying to average all together the developed and the underdeveloped world. And when we look at that, we see that actually the death rate is higher for the developed world than it is for the underdeveloped world. And that leads us to ask the question, why? Right? Why would the death rate be higher for countries with higher levels of economic, social development? The answer, my friends, is not blowing in the wind. The answer is in the demographic transition. So we're going to check this out, given a little bit of evidence to what we were talking about with the crew death rate. Now, again, there are some countries that are underdeveloped countries that have high crew death rates, right? Sub-Saharan Africa comes to mind. Look at Afghanistan there. Sitting right there above Pakistan, like no question. But there are other wealthy countries that have higher death rates as well. And like I said, the combined death rate of the developed world exceeds the combined death rate of the underdeveloped world. So let's get into what some of those reasons are for the death rate not following the same pattern as the birth rate, as the natural increase rate, as the total fertility rate. And the answer, we have to start off with this thing called the demographic transition. Now, what is the demographic transition? Well, it's this process of change in a society's population from high crew birth rates and high crew death rates moving to low crew birth rates and low crew death rates, ending up with a lower natural increase rate, but over that process, an explosion of population. So you could think of the demographic transition as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. And once you move to a new stage, you don't go back, right? Once a country moves from stage 1 to stage 2, it doesn't ever go back into stage 1. Well, what if the death rate fell, but then the death rate went back high again? Then it never really went into stage 2, right? See how they do that? Clever. It's very clever. So let's start off here with some of the reasons. Man, I would screenshot this. If there's a way to edit myself out of this, we would do that. I mean, I would try to get the heck out of the way here. I would screenshot this because this is one of the most consequential, important pictures that you could have that demonstrates not only what happened with population change over time as a country moves throughout the stages of the demographic transition, but also the reasons for the change in the birth rate and death rate at different stages in different times. I'm going to try to walk us through that. So when we talk about stage 1, no country is still in stage 1. Every country has seen the death rate drop. So that's a really important thing you need to understand. But in stage 1 countries, historically, we're talking about high crew birth rates, high crew death rates. It might vary from year to year. We might have years where we have a lot of births and the death rate fell, but that death rate's going to eventually come back up because for the most part, we have low natural increase rates, high birth rates, high death rates. Not a lot of gap in between the birth and the death. Now, the gap between the birth and the death, that's called the natural increase rate. But think about that video we watched in class where we looked at population growth over time. Pretty much from all of human history, from wherever you believe that was until about 1800, the whole world had high birth rates and high death rates. Think about that. Boom, 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 right? There might be population clusters that show up, but they might begin to disappear as well. And I know what you're going to say. Well, what about the first agricultural revolution? What about this Neolithic revolution that changed the game, that for the first time ever in human history saw people transition from hunting and gathering societies into domesticating plants and domesticating animals and settling down on a plot of land and staying there? Yes, that does lead to a more predictable food supply. Yes, that did lead to a population increase, but it wasn't necessarily sustainable because you still have things like warfare, still have things like conquest, still have things like natural disasters, still have things like plague, pestilence, famine. I know what you're asking yourself. What about the second agricultural revolution? That, it's so funny to hear anthropologists get in fights about when the second agricultural revolution actually started. A lot of people will say, oh, we're talking 1700 to 1850. Other people will be like, no, you got to start in the 1600s. We'll say it started in the 17th and 18th centuries, meaning the 1600s, moving ahead to the 1700s. When did it end? We'll let them fight about that. Here's the thing. The second agricultural revolution goes beyond domesticating plants and animals. Like, we figured that part out. We're going to now invent machines. We're going to now have crop rotation that is going to be suitable for restoring the nutrients of soil. We are now going to have different techniques with breeding livestock. We are going to now have transportation innovations, changes in machinery. I'm talking the cotton gin. I'm talking the reaper. I'm talking the thresher, right? All of these innovations are going to make it possible for there to be, for the first time, a large amount of surplus, moving from subsistence to surplus, moving for generating enough food to eat and survive so that we can have enough energy to do it again the next day, to having a surplus. And what are we going to do with that? Well, it's a good thing they did, because as they're generating a surplus of production, there's about to be a surplus of people, my friends. And I'm talking about the death rate taking the plunge, right? I'm talking about the death rate skyrocketing. I remember when I was a kid, man, we go to Kings Island, and I looked up for the first time at what they called the plunge, right? And I was like, that guy's just careening through the air. Like, at some point, his back's not even touching the water slide. That's what the death rate does, right? The death rate goes, plummets down. Now, as the death rate plummets down, you have the birth rate still remaining high. The death rate takes the plunge, and the birth rate's right here. There's a difference between the birth rate and the death rate. That's what we call the natural increase rate, my friends, and that's what we call the population increase. Now, you have this rapid increase of population that occurs during stage 2. Europe and North America are going to enter stage 2 when the Industrial Revolution hits. When the Industrial Revolution hits, moving off the heels of that second agricultural revolution, there's going to be more technological innovation. There's going to be mass production. There's going to be transportation and communication improvements. There's going to be communications and technology. It is this explosion of wealth, right? Anybody that says to you wealth can't be created is lying to you. Point them directly to the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution is going to have humongous changes in the level of wealth. And they're like, oh, look at all this wealth. I got a good idea. Let's upgrade our health, right? They're like, hey, all this explosion of wealth, what are we going to do with this? Oh, maybe let's live longer. And you're going to see changes in sanitation. You're going to see changes in water supplies, right? More predictable food supplies, obviously. You're going to see changes in personal hygiene. You're going to see changes in the quality of food. You're going to free people up to generate wealth working in factories, creating things for capital rather than be stuck in a farm creating food for survival. It is amazing what happens with the Industrial Revolution. It's going to start in, the Dutch and the British fight about whoever started it. But we'll say this. We'll say, for the most part, we think it started in England in the late 1700s. It diffuses to Europe, ultimately ends up in North America. And during this time period, we're going to see countries really get into a huge population explosion where the death rate drops. Here's the demographic transition model in England. Do we say stage 2 is only the result of the Industrial Revolution? Well, it depends on where you lived, right? If you live in Western Europe and North America, yeah, they got into stage 2 with the Industrial Revolution. But if you live in Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Latin America, you enter stage 2 as a result of the medical revolution. This medical technology is invented in Europe and North America, and it diffuses to developing countries. And these improved medical practices eliminated a lot of the traditional causes of death in those places. It enables people via immunizations, vaccines, cures for infectious diseases, right, to live longer and healthier lives, and we see the death rate drop that way. No country's is still in stage 1. Everybody's at least in stage 2. Right? So here's an example. Cape Verde, who is off the west coast of Africa. It's got a little European influence to it. It's got a little African influence to it. The way geographers call it is Half-African. I don't use that terminology very much, but that's the way, you sometimes see it referred to. Basically, the idea is this. They've only seen their death rate drop. They have not moved throughout the demographic transition. Here's their actual model. Now, on the bottom here, this is the generic model, right? Where we go from high birth, high death to dropping the death rate in stage 2. This is what their data actually looks like, where they actually saw a drop in the death rate right around the second half of the 20th century, right around 1950. But they haven't seen a sustained birth rate drop yet. So we would say they're still in stage 2, right? Again, the generic model is like this, but actual population model is a little bit more messy. So let's move to stage 3 for the very first time. We're going to see the birth rate drop. In stage 3, birth rates rapidly fall for the first time. And you start to see natural increase rates decreasing a little bit, right? The birth rate is still greater than the death rate. But what happens is you have this change in the way of thinking about having children, right? Economic changes in stage 3 induce people to have fewer offspring. They're more likely to live in cities than rural areas or the country. They're more likely to space is more expensive in the city, so they have smaller homes because of that space. Maybe they choose to have fewer kids because they live in smaller homes, right, to accommodate for their family size. Whatever the reason, as they move from agricultural to more urban, either in manufacturing or service jobs, they're choosing to have fewer kids. Kids are seen at this point as not economic assets, right? More economic detriments. You know what it takes to raise a kid? They say 0 to 18, you're looking at $150,000 in a developed country. I got 3 kids. That's $500,000, okay? That's a lot of money. When you start to say, and I don't see my kids in terms of dollar signs, by the way, like we may not even be done, right? But my point to all that is I'm not having kids to, send them out to the farm to get a little extra labor help, right? I'm not saying that's why everybody had kids in agricultural times, in subsistence times, but it certainly didn't hurt, right? You get a bunch of farmhands, you send them out, and they help out with the work. Now, we're not looking at kids as economic assets. We're looking at kids as like, oh man, this is going to cost us some money. And that changing way of thinking can also be a part of the dropping of the birth rate, right? It's a social custom. Here's a choice. Now you say, well, wasn't the fall in the death rate a choice? Everybody, for the most part, is trying to live longer. That's baked into the cake, right? That's baked into the human condition. But how many children a family chooses to have, that's a choice. It may be a delayed reaction to the drop in the infant mortality rate. It may be a delayed a reaction to, the changing role of children, moving from an agricultural to maybe a more manufacturing industrial society, right? Whatever it is, it's a choice. There's economic and social changes, different roles for women. And we're going to really see this in stage 4. Chile is an example of a country that's still in stage 3, right? And again, here's the generic model, but here's the actual model of birth and death rate in Chile. Now, let's move on to stage 4, the demographic transition. Now the birth rate begins to catch up with the death rate, and you have a low birth rate, low death rate, low natural increase rate. You end up with something they call ZPG, right? ZPG is typically referred to with stage 4 countries. That means zero population growth. Now, what TFR do you need for ZPG? Well, if it takes 2 to tango, those 2 need to replace themselves, right? So since only one of those 2 can biologically have children, right? The TFR of 2.1, total fertility rate, is the average number of children a woman is going to have in her lifetime. The 0.1 is for every girl that tragically, unfortunately, doesn't reach childbearing age, defined by the United Nations as 15 to 49. So 2.1 is like a replacement ratio. That's just to keep things even, Steven. But a natural increase rate is 0 with a total fertility rate of 2.1. Any increase is an increase. Any natural increase rate is multiplied by a country's current population to have an increase in population. That's important. Now, we're not talking about immigration here. We're only talking about domestic, or what we'd say like natural increase rate. Now, we are in North America in that ZPG. We're in that TFR of about 2.1. We're in that ZPG rate. We have the low birth rate. We have the low death rate. Same thing for Europe, right? And again, there are some other things that accompany this. 1, birth control, contraception, more women entering the labor force. When you enter the labor force, right, if you have more women entering the labor force, they oftentimes choose to have fewer kids. Not as a rule, right? But data shows us that as more women enter the labor force, that correlates with having fewer children, right? There's also this thing called emerging adulthood, which essentially, maybe we could talk about that at a later time. There's also, particularly as it relates to Eastern European countries, many countries have negative natural increase rates. And Eastern European aren't the only ones that have negative natural increase rates. Japan has a negative natural increase rates. A bunch of wealthy Western European countries have negative natural increase rates, right? So that is a component that we would want to look at. Denmark is an example of a country who has low birth rates, low death rates, low natural increase rates, right? But at the same time, they've already went through stage 2 and 3, so they've had the population explosion. That's an important key characteristic to know. If you move through stage 2 and stage 3, you've had this high natural increase rate, which begins to answer our question, why are death rates higher on aggregate in developed countries than underdeveloped countries? Because they have this population explosion and these people are getting older, right? So that's just the first little part of introducing you to the demographic transition. I hope you learned a lot. Now we'll extend that next time we're on here, but we did today describe the first 4 stages of the demographic transition. Here's the question: is there a stage 5? Well, stage 5 would mean that the birth rate goes under the death rate. And remember, we can't go back. So if the birth rate is below the death rate, we're talking extinction. Whoa. Russia's had a negative natural increase rate for 50 years, man. Are they going back? I don't know. That's for demographers to figure out. But we'll look at the evidence. See you next time.